Returning to the last part of the last three verses of chapter 38 of the book of Job, which is a dividing line, actually 39 and 39, 40, and 41, changes the subject from chapter 38, where the Lord was asking a series of questions, and he dealt with creation, and he dealt with the extraterrestrial or the terrestrial, and he talked about sustaining the earth and the universe. So there's so many things that we could talk about there, and he really invited us to explore. And the more I look at that passage, the more that I realize I don't know half the questions. One of the things I say about Pleiades and about the belt and so forth, Pleiades actually, from what I understand now, just studying it, is the Little Dipper. And it shows up brightly or more brightly in the summer month or winter months in the northern atmosphere. And from what scientists tell us today, they think that it's really the gravitational pull that keeps our Milky Way or our constellation together. I have no idea. Those are all things that are just above my head, and literally and figuratively. And so just the little things like that. And then we look at, that's the macrocosm, the cosmos, and we look at the microcosmos. And that was about amino acids and the things that are in our bodies. And it looks like those acids and the molecules in those acids from, again, Amanda was just studying this, that turn to, eventually the amino acids turn to whatever, and then they turn to proteins. But they say that everything that turns left, or they say left-handed and right-handed. Amino acids, I had no idea what they're talking about there. But they said the left-handed ones, or the ones that, I don't know how they could tell left-handed from right-handed, are the good amino acids as far as the things that build our bodies. And the right-handed ones are the ones who are the poisons, the arsenics, the things like that. And those are all part of the ratios of our body. And then I studied another man, and he talked about ratios and about how that if we had the ratio of oxygen to hydrogen to nitrogen in our air, and if you had too much oxygen or just a little bit more oxygen, it would be too flammable. And it would cause explosions a lot more, and too much. But if we didn't have enough oxygen, then it talked about the sea level, and if it was an inch lower than it is, then the atmosphere would be too thin, and if it was an inch higher, it'd be too thick. And all these different things that are the ratios. Now that God made this world so infinitely complex, and yet His wisdom not only created it, but He also sustains it. Now, as we see here then, as we go, we see that God holds the place together. As we saw back in Colossians chapter 1, in Him all things not really created, but they consist, or they stick together. And so God is only the creator of the universe, but He's the sustainer of the universe. Why, with all these stars, and there's trillions of them that are, I was listening to one man today, a man that I had in my church before. His name is Ken Covine. Remember him? He has a great ministry about creation. And he said that every one of us would have over 1 trillion stars that if we wanted to name them, we could, that we would have, that each one of us, if everybody on earth could own their portion of stars, each one of us would be a portion more than 1 trillion apiece. So that's just too big for me to even understand. And so we see that we are studying things that are much more complex and bigger than we are. And yet that's exactly what God invited Job to do, and by extension, through His inspiration of Scripture, for us to examine. And so we see that he talked about the earth and the creation in chapter 38, all the way to verse 38. And then we see that in these questions that like what Morris talked about. He said these questions that God asked Job, 8 verses deal with the creation week, and we saw that back in chapter 38. 27 deal with the physical world and its functions, the worlds and its functions. And then 33 deal with nature and animals. And then 2 more deal with 2 more animals that we'll deal with later on, the Leviathan and Behemoth. And we'll talk about that. Those are a whole different section. But so more questions and verses are devoted to animals than to the physiology or the physical universe. And so we see that God cares for the animals. And I like what the Lord said back in Matthew chapter 10, verse 29 through 31. He says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin," or we would say a penny, "and not one of them falls to the earth apart from his Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than the sparrows." And so we think of that. Was it Ethel Waters that sang that song back in the Billy Graham Crusades? His eye was on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. And now I like that because in Matthew it says two sparrows for a penny, we say. In Luke chapter 12, verse 6, he talks about 2 pennies will buy 5 sparrows. So I guess a penny will buy 2, and 3 will buy 2 pennies will buy 3. So 2 for a nickel, 3 for a dime, whatever. So we see that this is mentioned twice, that just a small amount back then would buy almost a worthless bird. And of course, a sparrow you're not going to get much meat off of it. And we see that God says he watches over what we would consider a very cheap sparrow. And then he tells us the very hairs of our head are numbered. And that kind of bothers me because other people have more hair than I do. But there again, he knows every hair on our head. That tells us that he knows every cell of our body. And if that's true, then he knows every cell of every living thing in the universe, every atom, every molecule, the largest star. Again, that's one of the things that I heard of, man, and I've been really trying to get into some of this, but it's just so big, and there's so much study of these verses. But one Moody scientist that came out a few years ago, and he said that in the equation of the smallest thing that man can find and the largest star that we know exists, right in the middle of that, as far as averages of size, is human beings. And so again, man is the center of God's creation. And so these are things that are far beyond our understanding, and yet God says he wants us to explore them. And so we've seen people, why is it that man wants to explore outer space and wants to explore the world and all this? It's really because God's given man an innate curiosity to the things around him. And so now, as we get into this section of zoology, the Lord throws out a lot of questions about a lot of different wild animals. He only names one animal that's tame, and yet he's got a wild streak in him. And so he's going to give us some things, and basically what he's saying here is, Job, you don't know how I take care of these animals I created, and yet I do. And so, Job, if I could take care of the animals without your knowledge, don't you think that I can take care of you? And even I have taken care of you sometimes, or many times without your knowledge, or even you knowing it. So his eye is on this sparrow, and I know he watches over me. And so we see that God cares for his people. Are you not worth more to God than a sparrow? Are you not worth more to God than an ox? Yes. And one thing that God has made man as the most valuable of his creation. And of course, he is not a product of animals. He didn't originate from animals. He was born with a living soul, which makes him separate from the animals. And as we look at this then, we see that Job was all concerned about, and the people around him are concerned about, how what is God doing? But, why is he doing this? And Job is asking why? Well, all Job really wanted was God's presence in his life. He was more concerned about that than anything else. And God comes to him, and God doesn't say anything to him other than, I'm here with you, Job. Now, let me ask you some questions. And that's all Job needed, was to know that God was there. But now God is going to ask these questions. And we see in verse 39, as he says, can you pray for the lion? Job, can you? Now, today we know that zoos try to do that to satisfy the appetite of young lions. How do you do this? And how do they survive, Job? I mean, do you have any control over that? In fact, what terrifies us about the lion is that he can take care of himself. And he terrifies man in how he can take care of himself. And so, Job, do you need to feed the lions? And of course, the answer is no. Did you see that comical thing, that news item that was in on the internet back, I guess, a week or two ago, about one of the Scandinavian countries, I think it was Norway, where they were having trouble with the lions or wild beasts eating tame, or just taking food that they were trying to feed them. And they were asking people to volunteer their unwanted dogs and cats just so the lions could eat them. And and boy, did it cause a stir. Everybody got all upset about it. But, from what I understand, that's the way snakes are too, and many snakes, is that they want live things. They don't want you to feed them anything or just a piece of meat. They want to kill it themselves. That's treacherous to us. And we love to think of Yogi Bear and all the rest and try to humanize animals. But they do have their animalistic instincts, and they don't eat out of picnic baskets, or whatever. They will, but it's against your will and so forth. But so he's saying, who feeds the animals, Job? And who feeds those lions? And of course, we know that now, again, this is a zoology, that's a study of these animals, and we have learned a lot about how to feed animals, and the born free, and all this. As free as the wind was about the lion Elsie, or whatever. And so you learn a lot about this. But what's the whole story about born free? Is that Elsie wanted to be free. How do we let her back out into the habitat or whatever? And so, Elsie doesn't need your help. Now, she needed your help for survival, but once she, all in all, animals take care of themselves. And why? Man doesn't control animals. And so, secondly, he says, what about the ravens? And with the ravens, in verse 40, where it talks about the lions and their dens and so forth. And again, you study that about lions and lions' dens and all those different things, and how that lions many times will kill their younger lions who are not part of their pride or whatever, and all these different things. How do they survive with all that going on within the dens? And yet we see that God says he takes care of the animals that he created. There's 12 different animals that he talks about here. One insect, 11 mammals. One tamed, and the other 11, not the insect, but the other are untamed animals. And he says, all these wild animals, the wild kingdom. And there again, you think, what was the name of that? It was the wild Mutual Omaha Wild Kingdom. What was the name of that guy that came on? Marlin Perkins. And then on Saturday mornings on WVCY, we don't have a station around here, but you have to get it on streaming. But they have Uncle Bob that comes on, and he'll talk about different animals. And he talks about it to a child. The last one I heard was about the woodpecker. And the woodpecker, how this has to have a specific type of build. It has to have a certain type of cushion in its head. It's got to have a certain appetite to get the worm out of the tree that God created, the worm and the tree, and all these different things. It has to have it has to have an eyesight, all these different things that it had to have, just the woodpecker. And of course, every week he has a different animal. And he talks about all this instincts and who trained it. And of course, how did it evolve? And of course, by implication, it can't evolve. Every animal that God created had a specific design and a function. And how can we say that one was created or one evolved from another? Because we have never seen any evolution. Now, we've seen some adaptations and so forth, but we have never seen, for instance, well, let's go back to stars. We have never seen a star formed. Have we? And yet, so how can we know the trillions of stars out there? We don't know their orbit. I mean, we know their orbits, and not a one of them run into each other. And some of them are huge. They have one star is got a million, could put a million Earths in it. How can that be? I don't want that thing to hit me, but it looks like that thing would just mow everything down because they're all traveling at thousands of miles an hour. Well, how do they miss each other? Because of the cosmos. Cosmos means organization. Logos means organization of thought, words. So the Greeks had two things: ideas, logos, and cosmos, objects, or how things function. And so we see that there was a definite order, there was a definite design. And Job, who taught the lions to hunt? And then the next thing in verse 40, he says, "And who provides food for the raven?" Now the raven, of course, is a vulture, or is a scavenger. And who provides food for it? Of course, things have to die. Did God design that? And what about those little mouths of those ravens? One time, when our kids were small, we had talking about, I think they were sparrows, not that much of the birds, but they had formed a nest on the eaves of the church, and or somebody knocked it down, and so here you have these those little birds, and they have big, huge mouths, but their mouths were bigger than their heads, and they're all begging for food. And I had the roughest time trying to figure out, what do I do with these sparrows? And these kids are, "Dad, they're going to die if we don't feed them." And I didn't know how to do it. I think they eventually died, or the cat got them. Well, I don't know. Scary. I mean, I hope the cat's sitting up. If that's the case, I hope my kids don't have trauma today from thinking about, all that. Edited, no. But there again, but what got me was the helplessness that I had of knowing how to feed a sparrow, or how to feed whatever that bird was. And yet God says, who taught the mother to feed that bird? And so, again, you can't do it, Job, but I can. Why 4,000 years later do we still have ravens? Why do we still have sparrows? I don't feed them. And there again, like I said, my lack of ability to know how to feed them, they'd all die if I had to take care of them. And so, Job, where were you? And they wander about for lack of food. They're hungry. Who feeds them? Their mama does. Well, how does she get it? How did she learn to hunt? How did she learn to go find the right food in the right place? But then you think about the ravens. Take that a little bit farther. God in His omnipotence, He sent a prophet out by a brook, and He had ravens do what? Bring Him fresh food. He's not going to dead something, because a prophet or a Jew wouldn't eat dead animals that were dead. So he brought him life. So can the Lord have functions? Can he have power and providence over a raven? Again, he's asking these questions, and you could start saying, and like I said, I've expressed my helplessness in knowing how to feed. I'm not a bird watcher. Maybe I could have fed. I don't know if those birds would have eaten bird food. Maybe I should have gone to the store and gotten some bird food for them. Worms or what? Well, I didn't even know where any worms were. So that helplessness that you have with 4 crying kids, Dad, what you gonna do? And so I don't know. I don't remember what we did. What did we do with those? You can't remember. I think she said. I think my wife ran and said, "You take care of it." But whatever it was, it was sad. But there again, can you feed the ravens? And how do they eat? And how do they survive? So that's just a couple. Now the third, he goes on, he says, do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear their young? Now we can figure that out today. Remember, this is a questions that we can ask. Zoologists can go out there, they can put cameras out there and all that, and they know the gestation period, they know the mating season, they know all these different things about the animals today that Job knew some, but not a whole lot. But today we have some scientific things that they have learned about mountain goats. Ibex, whatever they call them. But they have uncanny climbing ability. They love to be away from humans and all kinds of other things. Why do they survive up in the rocks and the crags of hills? And why do they want to be up there? And of course, they've got to worry about their young and about carnivorous birds coming in and taking their young. How do they survive with all that? He says, do you know the time that they bear their young? Today we can know that, but back then, Job was just learning. Now, he says, or can you mark the deer when it gives birth? They're again gestation periods. We know that mating seasons for deer and everything. We got it down to a science where we know exactly when to start hunting season and all the rest. And yet, these are all things that Job, now you're learning this stuff, and we don't know, Job probably forgot more than we'll ever learn. But there again, these are just questions he's throwing out. And he says, or can you name the number of months that are fulfilled, and know the time they bear their young? Yes, we can know that today. They bow down, they give birth to the young, they don't need a gynecologist to come in and help them. How do they do that? And so, they deliver their offspring. The young ones are healthy. They grow strong with grain. They depart and do not return. They leave home. It takes us 18 years to get a kid out of the house. And these animals are gone sometimes in days, if not months. Job, how can you tell me the difference in why I do this? And so he's asking these questions. And again, if you look back in chapter 12, verse 7 through 10, Job, and we won't take the time to do that, but that's a good verse, 12 7 through 10. Job asked that question, or it says that. He says, talking to Eliphaz, he says, we can learn a lot about God by observing the animals. And now God is saying, yeah, Job, we can. Let me teach you some things. Well, let me ask you some questions. And so we see that, we learn a lot about God by just what he's done in the universe. What he's done with animals. How does chloroform or chlorophyll or whatever it is go up a blade of grass? How does it defy gravity and grow up a tree? I don't understand all that. And that's botany. This is zoology, so let's stick with zoology. So he says the deer and the mountain goat. How do they survive when human babies can't? And yet we think that we're the top of the food chain. We think that we're the best, and yet they can survive better than humans can. Throw a baby out there when it's about 5 days old and see if it can survive. And then you look at, like I said, Marlin Perkins, and one week they'll have that poor little infant baby coming out of the mother's, whatever animal it is, that's a carnivore, that eats grass, and they seem like they're so helpless, and you wonder how they can survive with all the vultures and lions and hyenas and all that around them. And yet they do. And yet they have a protection. And so he said that, and yet they don't, we do know that because of the fall, not every animal always has a perfect birth, because there's always the problem with the whole creation groans until now. And so we do know that animals can be born deformed and all the rest. And so, but then again, how are they protected from all the things that want to eat them? And so how does God do that? And so one day, 1 week, Marlon Perkins would have a lion. And the poor lioness, her kids are going to die unless they get fresh meat. So you feel sorry for the poor lion and the lioness, or the cubs. Then the next week they'll have some, animal out there, antelope, some zebra, whatever, things that don't eat other animals. And then you feel sorry for the zebra because the lion comes to get him. And so back and forth you go. And so 1 week the lion is, you feel sorry for him. Next week he's the villain. But that's the way it is because of man's sin. The whole creation groans until now, and will until the Lord comes again, and the lion will lay down by the lamb again one day. But we see the world is cursed. But Job, have you experienced it? Then couple of them that I really like here are the wild donkeys. Now, he says, I like this in verse 5. Can the wild donkey be free? I think, is that the unicorn in the King James? He says, who loosed the bonds of the onager, which is a type of donkey that's known in Iran and so forth. In fact, it's becoming rare, so the idea of the wild donkey, especially the onager, or it's called a aurech, or Aureach. Anyway, that's an animal that was bigger than the regular ox, and yet smaller than maybe about the size of a hippopotamus or whatever. I mean, these were huge. Excuse me, that's an ox. Let's get into that later. But an onager was the wild donkeys. Again, these were free-spirited animals. He says, whose home I made in the wilderness. They love barren land. They don't like the things. And he scorns the tumult of the city. He does not heed the shouts of a driver. I mean, these guys, the wild donkey, you can't tame them. And yet, how can donkeys be domesticated? They have been. And yet it takes generations many times to get a donkey that is domesticated. We know, we think about the Lord's birth. Did he ride to Bethlehem on a donkey? Whatever, we don't know. But he says, they range the mountains as pasture, and it searches after every green thing. So a wild donkey, even though it's wild, doesn't eat. It's one thing it doesn't eat is other animals. And yet it's one of the wildest animals. Now, when the Lord uses this term wild donkey, he is not cutting someone down. For instance, Ishmael. If you remember, the angel told Ishmael's mother that he's going to be a wild donkey. Well, that didn't mean that he was going to be a weakling or a bad guy or whatever. It was almost a compliment. Also, remember, Esau was a rugged outdoorsman. And so Ishmael was going to be a rugged outdoorsman. He's going to be independent of other people, which is not a bad situation. And so being a wild donkey was more of a actually, it was more of a compliment than to being a shepherd, had to take care of sheep, and even the Egyptians hated shepherds. And so a wild donkey, how does it live? And, especially when it doesn't like men at all, and it really takes generations to even get them tamed. Remember the Lord, he sent his disciples in, and he said, find a donkey that has never been ridden. That was a miracle in itself. So they did. So what did he do? He rode on that donkey. what did he do? He showed that he had power over animals. And so, but Job, how does that work? Tell me about donkeys. But then the next one is the wild ox, and that's the one that the auroch or whatever they call it. But this was an ox that was very wild. But he said, the wild ox, will it serve you? Now we know there's a species of oxen that was able to be tamed, and they became very useful in the Old Testament, and especially if you had an ox in your stall, then it was like having a John Deere tractor in your barn. I mean, you were a better off farmer. And so, these animals he's talking about, this wild ox, this Aurach, Aurach, if you want the name, look it up. He says, how can you bind this thing with ropes? Can you let it plow the valleys, or can you make rows for you? Now, we're talking about something as big as an elephant or a hippopotamus. Now, we know that the oxen that were in the Bible, or the oxen, was a little smaller, and they were domesticated. But these aurochs, or whatever they call them, were wild, and there was no way you're going to hitch a plow to them unless you wanted a carved up yard, but they weren't going to be something that was going to be used to tread grain or whatever else. If you wanted, these things were big enough to turn over the millstone. So you wouldn't want them around. So he said, can you trust him? And of course the answer is no. So, but I made them. So what did I make them for, Job? I don't know, Lord. And why are they so big? Now, they were used, that term is used in other portions of the Bible, passages, but today we know of them as extinct. As we said, there are species of the onager, which is the wild donkey, which is in Persia, but they're becoming endangered today. So these are different terms that are used. Unicorn, wild ox. The King James sometimes had some very interesting ways that, there again, 1611, they didn't know. Again, we've had 400 and something years now to deal with language that they didn't have back then. So they did a good job of what they knew about translating the Bible back then. So I'm not downing it at all, but again, we think them more as that auroch, or whatever we talk about it. So, but then the one I really like is the wings of an ostrich. That's I titled this. His eye is on the ostrich. His eye is on the sparrow. We love singing that song, or we loved hearing it anyway. But his eye has to be on the ostrich, because he says she's like a wisdom. In other words, she's pretty dumb. And look what he says about her, the wings of an ostrich. Why does an ostrich even have wings? She has legs that are some of the most powerful in the animal kingdom. That leg can crush a lion or a man. And yet she's got a bird brain. She's a pretty dumb animal. Now, I've never really been around ostriches, but there was a couple of people around, a couple of them that came to our church in Michigan. And they were raising emus, which are similar to now I don't know, get into all the species and everything. I'm not a zoologist, but they look very much like an ostrich. The one thing that he would tell me, though, he said that beak on that emu is very sharp. And if you've ever seen an emu, that beak, it looks down at you and it looks mean. He said, don't get close to it and don't walk close to the fence, because he'll reach over that fence and peck you, and he could actually crush your skull with that beak. So you don't walk close to emus. So stay away, and even stay away from the fence, because they could reach over with that long neck. Why does God make birds like that? Why does he make an ostrich? It's a weird bird. They could run as fast as a horse. And yet he says she leaves her eggs on the ground and she warms them into dust. She forgets where she puts them. how many? Just like you ladies, did you ever forget your kids where you put them? No. Um, um, and or that a wild beast would break them. She treats her young harshly. She the kids hatch, and she says, "I don't want them." How do they survive? Her labor is in vain without concern. I mean, crazy, because God deprived her of wisdom, and He did not endow her with understanding. She's a dumb bird. Why did God do that? God has a sense of humor. And actually, again, I've read several people, and they say, we come, where were you, Job? And he's really asking, God is now kind of lightening up after those first couple of verses, and now he's just throwing things out at Job because he knows he's got him befuddled. And he throws in this ostrich. And he says, Job, when she lifts up herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. I mean, she's the one that thinks she could take on the horse and the rider. And yet she's so dumb she doesn't know how to take care of her own young. What? She runs fast. Yeah, she could run fast as a horse and kick as hard as a horse. She has feathers, but she can't fly. What did I make her, Job? And Job has to say, I don't know. What worth is an ostrich? Maybe they do have some worth. I know that I saw an old television show where there was a guy who put one of those little buggies like they have for horses on the back of one of those race horses, buggies, put on the back. And the way he guided it, he would put a little broom out, and wherever he put that broom, whichever way you turn the broom, the ostrich would run. I wouldn't want to be in back of an ostrich. Too many things that could go wrong. But, but then again, what if that thing kicked him? So you have to really know what you're doing to even deal with an ostrich. And how dumb can they get? And so he said, but then he contrasts that with one that he just mentions about the ostrich. Compare that to the stork in verse 13. He says, for she has wings, but not like the storks. And the stork, of course, is a big, beautiful, when it flies, it's got tremendous. Contrast that with an ostrich. Big old ugly bird compared to a graceful stork. And the stork, difference. I mean, both the husband and wife, the mates, they both take care of the nest. They protect their young. They fly to thousands of miles. When some of these storks fly from the Antarctic down to South America every year. How do they do that and back? And then take care of their young? How does that happen? There's a certain species that come from Alaska, and they go way down close to the Antarctica, and then 2 weeks later, their young that they've hatched that year fly down with them to meet them. How did they learn? Wait a minute, I thought moms had to be around to teach their kids how to get to school. How do the kids learn that? You tell me. They're still trying to study that. There's a certain place out there in California, a certain island, where every year exactly at the date of the year, thousands of birds come and land on that island. How? And who taught them? And so compare that dumb ostrich, which I've kind of, with a beautiful dove or beautiful stork. And then because the storks have such qualities of parenting, what do we think of the stork? It's the one who delivers babies, right? Again, just we haven't. What's that? We just have it's interesting as you study this stuff, and the Lord's just throwing these questions out. Job, and I think he's kind of lightened up on Job now because he's not trying to overpower him as far as keep him quaking. Then the horse. The horse, and again, we'll just, for the lack of time, he compares that to the grasshopper. Both of them can jump. One of them weighs a few ounces, the other one weighs hundreds of pounds. And yet both of them can jump. Tell me, Job, how did I do that? And why does a grasshopper can jump so far with such small little muscles, and yet the horse has huge muscles, but it can jump comparatively as far as it's, I don't know, you get in all the different sizes and ratios and everything. But how can that happen, Job? And why did I design a horse like that? And then with the horse, he gives and this is the only domesticated animal he's talking about. He's talking about a war horse here. But he says, have you given, who gives it strength? And of course, we look at horses, and people are fascinated with horses. I don't know why girls are fascinated with horses, but so many books have been written about girls riding horses and Black Beauty and all the rest of them. And so he says, the war horse, excuse me, and you can't frighten them. There's something about a horse that is trained, excuse me, but they're different than an elephant. We used to, you've heard about Hannibal crossing the Alps with an elephant. Well, a lot of people don't realize is only one of those elephants survived. The rest of them died crossing the Alps, and they really never were much for him in battle. Scipio, whenever Hannibal went back to Africa, and the Romans followed him, Scipio was the Roman general. And he had his war horses, and he had his cavalry there, but he knew a little bit about African elephants, and he knew they weren't good in battle. And so he blew the trumpets, blared them at the elephants. They turned and ran and just caused and they were the mainstay. They were right in the center of Hannibal's line. And Scipio defeated Hannibal in Africa. And so, we think about Hannibal and his elephants. The elephants weren't that good in battle once you learn how to beat them. You didn't even have to whip them. You just had to blow a horn. A war horse charges right through. In fact, the bugle is what calls them. And they're not afraid. And so he paws in the valley in his strength, and he's ready to go, and he gallops, and he clashes into the clash, into the clash of arms. He's right there in the middle. I mean, if you have a horse, it's like having a tank. I mean, and of course, all through history, we know the horsemen. And even, was it Amos who said, if footmen scare you, if the cavalry scare you, just imagine what if the infantry scare you, just imagine what the cavalry do. If footmen scare you, what will the horsemen do? And so, of course, he says, tell me about it. And why did I make a horse? And what makes them so different as compared to the locust? And then the last two. He says, can the hawk fly by your wisdom? And again, the hawk here is talking about those migratory birds. He says, notice now in verse 26, can the hawk fly by your wisdom? Your wisdom? Did you teach it to have that radar? Did you teach it to have that GPS? And tell me, how does it have a GPS? So again, and spread its wings toward the south. Again, migratory birds, back and forth. How does it do it? And so again, different hawks. Of course, we know some hawks are more migratory than others. But there are different species that do all this migration. And then he says, what about the eagle? Why does an eagle make its nest on high? Now, of course, they put them in trees and so forth, but they're high. One time, I was mountain climbing with a bunch of teenagers on a huge mountain. What was it? It wasn't Pisgah, but it was one close to it. And it was so high that the eagles were flying, and we could see the top of the eagles as they were flying. And it was beautiful. I mean, huge, wingspans. And then they fly back up. Now, you don't want to be around that eagle's nest, but, they would go up to the rocky points or whatever. But it was just beautiful to see that. But how can an eagle, being hundreds of feet up in the air, look down and see that little old 6-inch trout in the river? How can it do it? And how did God design that? And why didn't God give me that eyesight and give the eagle something better? Well, I wish he would have given me that eyesight. That way I wouldn't need glasses. Why does God do that? How did he do it? And why did the eagle get his eyes? And there's a couple animals that can't see. But why does a bat not have eyes? It's got radar. How does God do that? And tell me, you evolutionists, tell me how any of these evolved. Tell me, okay, if you can't tell me how they evolved, tell me how they function. Tell me how they do it. Tell me their instincts. Tell me, and I've used this illustration, the one that fascinates me is, especially around here, you get out on some of these country roads and going to Sycamore or whatever, and in the springtime you'll see 1,000 birds fly one way, and just out of nowhere they make a 90-degree turn, and all of them turn at the same time. Who taught them that? You evolutionists, please tell me. Now, science is observation, and with observation you find out how and why. So tell me how and why they do that. If you can't tell me, that tells me that you really might not know much about evolution, or that it's a myth. And you can go right back. You can't tell me about stars. You can't tell me how they're created. You can't tell me why they don't hit each other. You can't tell me anything about the universe. And you can't tell me a thing or much of anything. Now, the only thing you can tell me is what God has challenged you with, is because he does tell you to be fruitful and multiply and to manage the earth. So he did give you a brain to learn about these things. And yet you start off with the Creator and not with your imagination. And so again, we see that all through here, God is saying, I made the universe and I know how it works. And David tells us in Psalm 100 what? It is he that has made us and not we ourselves. So if God can take care of a dumb ostrich, can he take care of you? You say, I've made some pretty bad blunders in life. Yeah, haven't we all? You look at the church. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock, upon the fact that Jesus is Lord, so I'm going to build my church. If you study church history, it's some of the most frustrating things. How in the world can the Lord bless church? I mean, it's some of the most disheartening things that churchmen have done and churches have done. How did they survive? We are dumb as ostriches. And yet God still uses the church today. And he'll use it until he takes it home. And if he could use the church as a group, does he not know the sinner that he saved by grace? His eye is on the sparrow. His eye is on the ostrich. His eye is on you. If he knows the number, I wonder how God, it says the hairs of your head are numbered. I know when I go to the dentist will say, oh, number 32 there. The hygienist will say, so they got them all numbered. And so as soon as they say 32, you know exactly, I think it's 32. Is there 32 teeth? Whatever. Anyway, 26. Whatever, whatever the tooth is, they know exactly which one you're talking about. I wonder if the Lord says, that lady down there, she's got, see that number 120? Let's let it fall out just to cause her some problem. No, we won't do that. So he's already done that with me. So I offered I went and got my hair cut yesterday and I offered the barber $50 if he could figure out a way to get some more hair on my head. And he said, well, I'll have to pass on that one. But there again, and I talked to another barber one time. And I said, well, I don't have enough hair, so you should give me a discount. And he said, well, it just takes me longer to find it. So, you still have to pay for your haircuts. But tell me, he's throwing out a lot of questions. Can anybody answer any of these for me? Can anybody give me a little bit better insight? What's there? I mean, again, that dumb bird, that's the one that really gets me, is the ostrich. But how does God do that? And yet Job, and really what God is saying, he's implying, Job, you don't know any of this, but I've been with you the whole time, and you didn't know it. The ostrich doesn't know that I'm with you, or with him. And if it seems so out of control for them, and you know I'm in control there, am I not controlling your life? Even though it looks pretty bad at the time. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. God knows how to work things and all the atoms and all the different things of the universe. He knows how to bring them together for good to them that love God. But to them, the one thing you don't want is, but it's a fearful thing to fall in the hands of an angry God. So take your choice. And so again, it would behoove us to talk to the animals or observe the animals and how God takes care of them. And to say, Lord, if you can do that for them, you can do it for me. Okay, well, let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Lord, we thank you for the imponderables. We thank you for what we've learned from it, and even the challenges you give us to learn from it, whether it's the sun, moon, and stars or the animals. But Lord, we realize that everything comes from you. You created everything out of nothing. And yet, Lord, if you created us, you even created our very ability to think, just like you created the radar in a bat's head and the eagle's eye. Lord, you give us our soul. And Lord, we don't even understand how you did that. What chemical reactions do we have that cause us to even have brain waves? And yet, Lord, you saw fit to make us in such a way that we would call upon you, realizing that we have an emptiness within inside that only you can fill. Bless your people, Lord. May we understand that we don't understand everything, but that we know that we serve a God who understands everything. For I pray in Jesus' name, amen.